Between November 3rd and 7th, 1980, 10 law enforcement officers were eliminated across the remote hollows of Mercer County, West Virginia, in what would become known as the Stony Creek Massacre. All adults, all connected to a single moonshine raid. The method was surgical, rifle shots from distance, ambushes on dark mountain roads, accidents that weren't accidents. The perpetrators weren't drug cartels or organized criminals. They were 4 members of the Harlow family, a father and his 3 sons moving through the mountains like ghosts, methodically erasing everyone who'd destroyed their livelihood. The FBI would later call it the most calculated retaliation against law enforcement in Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't a drug war, wasn't random violence, wasn't even a blood feud passed down through generations. It was an 88-year-old copper still that represented 5 generations of survival, smashed to scrap metal by federal agents who'd been warned what would happen if they came. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Stony Creek Hollow, Mercer County, West Virginia, wasn't much more than a creek bed cutting through steep ridges where Route 52 curved through the mountains in the fall of 1980. Population scattered across 420 square miles of terrain, so rugged that some families lived 40 miles from the nearest paved road. The new river gorge carved through the county's heart, dropping 1,000 feet in places, creating valleys so deep that sunlight only touched the bottom for 3 hours each winter day. Most folks in Mercer County had never been farther than Charleston, 110 miles north. November in the mountains meant temperatures dropping to 35 degrees at night, rising to maybe 50 by afternoon if you were lucky. The air smelled like wood smoke from coal stoves, damp leaves rotting on the forest floor, and that particular metallic scent of approaching winter that mountain people learn to recognize by the time they're 5 years old. Mornings brought fog so thick you couldn't see 20 feet ahead on the road. The sound of the place was wind moving through bare branches, distant coal trains grinding through valleys, and every so often the rumble of a pickup truck struggling up some impossible grade in first gear. But 1980 was a catastrophic year in southern West Virginia. The coal industry that had sustained these mountains for a century was dying in real time. Mechanization had eliminated 15,000 jobs across the region in just 5 years. Companies were pulling out, leaving behind abandoned mines and families with no way to make a living. In Mercer County, unemployment hit 28% that fall, the highest rate in the state. For men who'd grown up believing that hard work and dangerous conditions guaranteed survival, watching the economy collapse felt like a betrayal of everything they'd been promised. Mines that had employed 300 men now operated with 30, running automated equipment that could do in 8 hours what had once taken a full shift of workers. The younger generation was leaving, heading north to Ohio and Michigan looking for factory work that was also disappearing. What remained were men over 40 who'd spent their entire adult lives underground, who had black lung developing in their chests, who knew no other skills and had nowhere else to go. In places like Stony Creek Hollow, moonshine wasn't rebellion or criminal enterprise. It was the economy, always had been. Federal taxes on legal liquor made it too expensive for mountain people, so they made their own, following recipes passed down through generations, using skills their ancestors had brought from Scotland and Ireland 2 centuries before. The law said it was illegal. The mountains said it was survival. And in 1980, with no other jobs available, no other way to feed families, moonshining was the difference between keeping your home and watching your children go hungry. The Reagan administration had just taken office with promises to crack down on illegal activity, and that included the stills hidden in every hollow across Appalachia. The Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau had received increased funding, new agents, orders to make examples of moonshiners. In Washington, it was about law enforcement statistics and budget justifications. In West Virginia, it was about destroying the only livelihood people had left. The New River carved through Mercer County like a scar, dropping through gorges that were 1,000 feet deep in places, creating terrain so broken and wild that even experienced hunters got lost. The county seat, Princeton, held barely 7,000 souls who knew each other's business going back decades. Outside town, the population scattered across hollows and ridges, connected by roads that turned to mud when it rained and ice when winter came. Sound traveled strange in those mountains. Sometimes you'd hear a truck engine 2 miles away, clear as a bell. Other times you wouldn't hear a man walking 10 feet behind you. The forests were second growth, cut over in the 1920s and 30s, now thick with oak and hickory and pine. Deer moved through in herds of 20 or more. Black bears were common enough that people stopped being surprised when they found one in their garbage. At night, when the temperature really dropped and fog rolled down from the ridges, you could hear the mountains settling, trees creaking, streams running cold over limestone, and the occasional distant sound of a still firing up, that low rumble of fire, heating copper coils somewhere deep in the woods. By 1980, everyone knew where the stills were. The sheriff knew. The state police knew. Even some federal agents knew. But there was an unspoken understanding, a mountain code that said, you left people alone unless they caused trouble. The moonshiners paid off the local law, when necessary, kept their operations small enough not to attract attention, and everyone looked the other way because the alternative was watching families starve. But that understanding was about to shatter. The federal government didn't care about local arrangements or mountain codes or the fact that these weren't criminals, but desperate families trying to survive economic collapse. They cared about enforcement statistics, conviction rates, making examples that would justify next year's budget. And when federal authority collided with mountain justice, when men who'd never lived in Appalachia decided to enforce laws on people who'd been ignoring those laws for 200 years, the result was inevitable. Blood and fire and consequences that would echo through the mountains for decades. The Harlows had been warned. Everyone had been warned. But warnings only matter when people listen, and the federal government wasn't listening. They were coming with sledgehammers and arrest warrants, completely unaware that in doing so they were signing their own death warrants. 10 men would die because they believed federal law meant more than mountain justice. 10 families would be destroyed because someone in Washington decided that moonshiners needed to be made examples of, regardless of the human cost. Elijah Robert Harlow was 57 years old that November, though he looked closer to 70. He stood 6'3", but stooped forward from 3 decades spent hunched in coal seams, barely 4 feet high. His face was weathered like old leather, deep lines carved around his eyes from squinting into sun and coal dust. A thick scar ran from his right shoulder blade down to his spine, souvenir from a roof collapse in 1972 that killed 3 men standing right beside him and left him buried under rock for 40 minutes before rescue crews dug him out. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen from breaks that had never set quite right. The left ring finger missing from the second knuckle up, taken by a conveyor belt malfunction in 1968. Calluses covered his palms, thick as boot leather. When he shook your hand, you felt the strength there, but also the damage. The decades of hard labor that had broken his body down piece by piece. Every morning, Elijah woke at 4:45. In the house his grandfather had built in 1923, made coffee in a percolator on a wood stove, and sat at the kitchen table smoking hand-rolled cigarettes while he planned his day. He didn't talk much in those early hours, just sat, smoked, drank coffee so strong it could strip paint, and thought. By 5:30 he'd be out the door, checking the still hidden 3 miles up Stony Creek Hollow, following trails only he and his sons knew. He'd served in Korea from 51 to 53, came home with frostbite scars on both feet and nightmares that woke him up, sweating 30 years later. The Army had taught him discipline, tactics, patience, how to move through terrain without being seen, how to wait for the perfect shot, how to eliminate a target efficiently, skills he thought he'd never use again, but skills that never really left you. He'd married Ruth Ellen Henderson in 1954. Right after his discharge. They'd had 3 boys, Carter, Mason, and Boone. Ruth had died in 1978 at 54 years old, her lungs destroyed by decades of breathing coal smoke from the stove she cooked on every day. Black lung, the doctor said. Same disease, killing the miners. But Ruth had never set foot in a mine. She'd just cooked 3 meals a day for 30 years in a kitchen filled with coal smoke. What Elijah valued most wasn't money. He'd never had much anyway. What he valued was legacy, independence, the idea that a man could still make his own way without bowing to government regulations or corporate bosses. His great-grandfather had built the family still in 1892, during the first federal crackdown on moonshine. That still had kept the Harlow family alive through the Depression, through wars, through every economic catastrophe the 20th century had thrown at the mountains. The copper coils had been replaced twice, repaired countless times, maintained with a care most people reserved for family heirlooms because that's exactly what it was. The recipe had passed from father to oldest son for 5 generations, Elijah's great-grandfather to his grandfather, grandfather to his father, father to Elijah, and someday Elijah had planned to pass it to Carter. It wasn't just whiskey, it was identity. The only thing of value the Harlow family had ever created, the only inheritance Elijah could leave his sons in a world where men like him had nothing else. Carter James Harlow was 31 that November, the oldest son, built like his father but without the stoop yet. 6'2", lean and ropey with muscle from physical labor. He'd served in Vietnam from 68 to 70, came home with a scar across his left forearm from shrapnel, and a Purple Heart he kept in a drawer and never looked at. He'd worked in the mines until they closed, then turned full-time to helping his father run the still. Carter had his father's discipline, but more anger, the kind that simmered quiet and cold until it exploded. He'd been engaged once to a girl named Sarah Mullins, but she'd left for Columbus in '76 and never came back. Now he lived alone in a trailer half a mile from the family homestead, spent his evenings cleaning rifles and reading military history. Mason Thomas Harlow was 28, quieter than his older brother but just as capable, 5'11", stockier build, with their mother's dark eyes and their father's hands. He'd done one tour in Vietnam with Carter, 70 to 71, came home and tried to make a life. Married a local girl, Rebecca, had 2 daughters, Emily and Sarah, ages 5 and 3. Mason worked at a lumber mill until it closed in '79, then joined the family operation full-time. He didn't talk about the war, didn't talk much about anything, just worked, went home to his family, came back the next day. But those who knew him understood that quiet didn't mean soft. And Mason Harlow was the kind of man who thought carefully before acting, but never hesitated once he'd made a decision. Boone William Harlow was 25, the youngest, and in some ways the deadliest. 6 foot even, lean as a whip, with pale blue eyes that never seemed to blink. He tried to enlist in '74, but the war ended before he finished training. Came home disappointed, worked odd jobs, hunted constantly. Boone could shoot a running deer at 300 yards. The still hidden 3 miles up Stony Creek Hollow wasn't just equipment. It was heritage made tangible, 5 generations of Harlow survival, distilled into copper coils and oak barrels, and knowledge passed father to son since 1892. Elijah's great-grandfather, Josiah Harlow, had built the original structure during the first federal crackdown on moonshine, when revenuers swept through Appalachia trying to enforce taxes that mountain people considered theft. Josiah had chosen the location carefully, a natural shelf of rock beside a cold spring, sheltered by hemlocks so thick that even in winter you couldn't see the site from 50 feet away. The spring provided pure water, essential for quality whiskey. The rock shelf kept everything dry even during spring floods. The hemlocks provided cover and the particular quality of shade that kept temperatures stable year-round. The copper coils themselves were the heart of the operation, custom formed in 1923 by a metalworker in Bluefield who'd understood exactly what they were for but never asked questions. Those coils had been maintained, repaired, resoldered dozens of times over 57 years. Every dent told a story, every patch marked a moment in family history. The wooden fermentation barrels were oak, some dating back to Josiah's time, the wood so saturated with yeast and bourbon that they gave the whiskey its distinctive flavor without any additional aging. The firebox was built from stones hauled up from the creek bed, fitted so precisely that no mortar was needed, designed to burn hot and clean with minimal smoke. The whole operation could produce 50 gallons per week when running at full capacity, though the Harlows usually kept it to 30 or 35 to avoid attention. The recipe itself was the real treasure, perfected over 90 years of experimentation. The ratio of corn to barley to rye, the fermentation time that varied by season and temperature, the temperature curve during distilling that determined flavor and proof. Elijah knew it by heart, had learned it working beside his father for 20 years, before the old man died in 1968. Carter knew it, Mason knew it, even Boone had learned the basics, though he preferred hunting to cooking. This wasn't written down anywhere, wasn't recorded, existed only in the memories of men who understood that some knowledge was too valuable to risk putting on paper where revenuers might find it. The still generated approximately $800 per week, $3,200 per month. Money that kept the Harlow family fed and housed when every other option had disappeared. The mines had closed. The lumber mill had shut down. There were no jobs within 40 miles that paid more than minimum wage, and those were scarce. Social Security didn't cover men who'd worked off the books their whole lives. Disability required paperwork and lawyers and years of fighting bureaucracy. The still was immediate, reliable, the only income source that didn't require begging or paperwork or submitting to a system that had already failed them completely. But more than money, the still represented independence. Elijah's great-grandfather had built it as an act of defiance against federal control. In the mountains, you didn't let the government tell you what you could make or sell or drink. Roland James Vickers was 43 years old that fall, a career ATF agent who'd transferred to the Charleston field office in September 1980, with orders to make examples of Appalachian moonshiners. He stood 5'10", built solid, with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an academic look, completely at odds with his reputation for aggressive enforcement. He'd grown up in Richmond, Virginia, graduated from the University of Virginia in '59, joined ATF in '61, and spent 20 years working his way up through raids on cigarette smugglers, illegal gun dealers, and bootleggers. He was thorough by the book and utterly convinced that law enforcement meant enforcing every law equally, regardless of circumstances or regional customs or economic desperation. Vickers had brought a team of 6 federal agents with him from Richmond, all younger men in their late 20s and 30s, all ambitious, all seeing Appalachian moonshine as easy targets for building arrest records and conviction statistics. They'd coordinated with local law enforcement, specifically 4 deputies from the Mercer County Sheriff's Department who knew the terrain and could guide them to the major operations. The local sheriff, Tom McKenzie, 62 years old and 3 months from retirement, had cooperated reluctantly, warning Vickers repeatedly that destroying stills in Mercer County wasn't like busting bootleggers in the city. These were families, desperate families, and the mountains had their own codes that federal law didn't recognize or understand. Vickers had dismissed the warnings. Law was law. If people were breaking federal statutes, they needed to be arrested, their operations shut down, examples made. The fact that unemployment was nearly 30% didn't matter. The fact that these families had no other income didn't matter. The fact that moonshining had been part of mountain culture for 2 centuries didn't matter. What mattered was enforcement statistics, conviction rates, demonstrating to Washington that the increased ATF budget was being used effectively. What mattered was career advancement, showing superiors that Roland Vickers could handle difficult assignments in hostile territory. What mattered was proving that federal authority meant something even in places where people thought they could ignore it. The Harlow operation had been identified through surveillance in mid-October. An informant, a cousin of the Harlows, who'd been arrested on unrelated charges and offered a deal, had provided the location of the Stony Creek still. Vickers and his team had observed from a distance for 2 weeks, documenting activity, photographing the Harlows coming and going, building a case. They'd planned the raid for November 1st, a Saturday morning when they expected to catch the family at the site. The plan was simple: overwhelming force, fast execution, seize the equipment, arrest anyone present, destroy the still so completely it couldn't be rebuilt. What Vickers didn't understand was that the Harlows had been warned he was coming. The cousin who'd informed had felt guilty enough to send word through another family member. The local deputies, who hated working with the federal agents anyway, had mentioned the planned raid within earshot of people who made sure the information reached Stony Creek Hollow. On October 28, 1980, a Tuesday evening when the temperature had dropped to 40 degrees and frost was forming on windshields, Sheriff Tom Mackenzie drove up the rutted dirt road to the Harlow homestead and sat in his truck for 10 minutes before getting out. He'd known Elijah Harlow for 30 years, had gone to school with Ruth Ellen before she married Elijah, had attended her funeral 2 years ago, and stood beside Elijah at the graveside. Mackenzie was a mountain man himself, understood the codes, understood what he was about to do, could start something that couldn't be stopped. But he also understood that if he didn't deliver the warning, what happened next would partly be his fault. Elijah met him at the door, didn't invite him in, just stood on the porch in a flannel shirt and work pants, waiting. Mackenzie explained it plain. The ATF was coming, led by an agent named Vickers, who didn't understand how things worked in the mountains, who was planning to raid the Stony Creek site on November 1st. The plan was to destroy everything, make arrests, set an example. Mackenzie said he'd tried to talk Vickers out of it, tried to explain that there were better ways to handle moonshine in Mercer County, that destroying a family's only income was going to create problems, worse than any illegal still. Vickers hadn't listened. So Mackenzie was here, off the record, giving Elijah the chance to shut down voluntarily, maybe move the operation, anything to avoid what was coming. Elijah listened without expression, thanked Mackenzie for the warning, and said nothing else. Mackenzie understood what that silence meant. He drove back down the mountain knowing he'd just lit a fuse, but hoping maybe the Harlows would see sense and disappear into another hollow, start over somewhere else. What he didn't understand was that starting over wasn't possible. The Stony Creek site had been chosen for specific reasons: the spring, the shelter, the accessibility. More than that, it represented 5 generations of Harlow presence in that exact location. Moving wasn't an option. Shutting down voluntarily wasn't an option. The still was staying exactly where it had been for 88 years, and anyone who came to destroy it would face consequences. On October 30th, 2 days before the planned raid, Elijah sent his own message through an intermediary, a man who worked odd jobs for both the Harlows and some of the local deputies. The message reached Vickers at the ATF field office in Princeton. It was simple, direct, and completely serious. Touch that still, there will be consequences. Leave it alone, everybody lives. Come with sledgehammers, somebody dies. Vickers read the message, laughed, showed it to his team as an example of exactly the kind of lawless attitude they were being sent to correct. He filed it as evidence of intimidation and threats against federal officers, another charge to add when they made arrests. The message hadn't been a threat in Vickers' understanding of the word. It had been a promise, a final warning delivered according to mountain code that said, "You gave a man fair notice before you acted. November 1st, 1980 came cold and heavy with fog. The temperature at dawn was 38 degrees, the air so thick with moisture you could taste it. Visibility on Route 52 was less than 100 feet, the kind of morning when smart people stayed home and waited for the sun to burn through. But Roland Vickers and his team of 9 men, 6 federal agents and 3 local deputies, one had refused to participate, were already moving up the logging road towards Stony Creek Hollow by 5:30 a.m. They drove as far as the road allowed, then proceeded on foot, carrying sledgehammers, axes, evidence bags, and cameras. The plan was to hit the site at dawn, document everything, destroy the operational equipment, seize anything that could be used as evidence, and be out before full daylight. The Harlows weren't there. Elijah had moved his sons to a secondary location 2 miles east, a small cave system where they stored backup supplies and occasionally did preliminary fermentation work. He'd known the exact timing of the raid, had watched the ATF vehicles pass his homestead in the pre-dawn darkness, had let them go. This wasn't about stopping the raid. This was about letting them commit the act that would justify what came after. Mountain justice required that the offense be completed, witnessed, undeniable. You didn't act on intentions. You acted on deeds. So the Harlows waited in the cave, drinking coffee from thermoses, cleaning rifles, and listening to the distant sounds of destruction echoing through the hollow. The federal agents reached the still site at 5:47 a.m., just as the first gray light was filtering through the hemlocks. They found it exactly as surveillance had shown, the copper coils gleaming dully in the shadows, barrels arranged in neat rows, the firebox cold but surrounded by split wood ready for the next run. Everything was clean, organized, maintained with obvious care. For a moment, even Vickers recognized they were destroying something that represented more than criminal activity. Then he gave the order, and his men went to work with sledgehammers. The copper coils, 97 years old, custom formed, irreplaceable, were smashed first. The sledgehammers rang against metal, crushing the carefully soldered joints, flattening the precise curves that controlled temperature and flow. Each blow destroyed knowledge that couldn't be written down, craftsmanship that couldn't be replicated. The wooden barrels were staved in, 50 gallons of aging whiskey poured out onto the ground, the smell of corn mash and oak filling the hollow. The firebox was dismantled, the stones scattered. Smaller equipment, thermometers, hydrometers, copper fittings, was loaded into evidence bags. What couldn't be carried was destroyed in place. The whole operation took 40 minutes. By 6:30, the Stony Creek still was wreckage. Vickers had photographs taken from every angle, documenting the destruction for his report. He personally spray-painted a sign on a sheet of plywood and nailed it to a hemlock tree, raided by ATF November 1, 1980. Then he led his team back down the mountain, satisfied they'd sent a clear message that federal law applied even in the remotest hollows of West Virginia. At 7:15 a.m., Elijah Harlow and his 3 sons approached the still site from the east, moving quietly through the fog, though there was no longer any need for silence. They could smell it before they saw it, the sharp scent of spilled whiskey mixing with the morning dampness. They could hear it too, the absence of the familiar sounds, the small creaks and drips of a working still replaced now by nothing but wind and dripping trees. When they reached the site, they stopped at the edge of the clearing and stood looking at what remained of 5 generations of family heritage. The copper coils were flattened, unrecognizable. 97 years of careful maintenance destroyed in minutes. The barrels their great-grandfather had built were kindling. The firebox Elijah's grandfather had laid, stone by stone, in 1923, was scattered across the ground. Everything that could be broken had been broken. Everything that could be stolen had been taken. The spray-painted sign hung from the hemlock like a declaration of war. Elijah stood absolutely still for 17 minutes, his sons flanking him, nobody speaking. His hands hung at his sides, the left one, with its missing ring finger, both scarred and calloused from decades of work that had all led to this moment. His breathing was steady, controlled, the same breathing he'd learned in Korea when preparing to take a shot at distance. Carter's hands were shaking, not from cold, but from rage. So intense, it required physical manifestation. His jaw was clenched tight enough that the muscles stood out like cables. Mason stared at the wreckage with his mother's dark eyes, calculating, already planning. Boone's pale blue eyes moved across the scene, taking in every detail, the boot prints in the soft ground, the specific way the copper had been crushed, the carelessness of it. Later he would identify which man had swung which sledgehammer based on the angle and force of the blows. But in that moment he just stood waiting for his father's word. When Elijah finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational, the tone of a man discussing the weather or the price of feed corn. They were warned. We gave them fair warning. They came anyway. They destroyed our lives. Now we destroy theirs. He turned and walked back toward the cave where their rifles waited, where the maps and surveillance notes they'd been compiling for 2 weeks were spread on a wooden crate. His sons followed without question, without discussion. There was nothing to discuss. The offense had been committed. Mountain justice demanded response. The code their father had taught them, the code their grandfather had followed, the code that went back generations to Scotland and Ireland and blood feuds that lasted centuries. That code was clear. You were warned. You acted anyway. You accepted the consequences. By 8 a.m., the Harlow family was gathered in the cave, rifles laid out on a blanket, ammunition sorted, maps marked with locations and times. Elijah assigned targets methodically, explaining approach routes, fallback positions, timing sequences. This wasn't rage, wasn't impulsive violence. This was tactical planning executed by men who'd been trained by the military and hardened by decades of dangerous work. 10 men had participated in the raid. 10 men would die. November 1st, 1980. The evening after the raid, the temperature dropped to 32 degrees as the sun disappeared behind the western ridges. The Harlow homestead sat dark except for one window, the kitchen, where a single kerosene lamp cast yellow light across a scarred wooden table that had been in the family since 1923. Elijah sat at the head of that table, the same place his father had sat, the same place his grandfather had sat before him. His 3 sons, occupied the other sides, Carter to his right, Mason to his left, Boone directly across. Between them lay 4 rifles, Winchester Model 70 bolt actions in 30-06, scoped and zeroed, maintained with the same care the family had given to the copper coils, now lying crushed in Stony Creek Hollow. Elijah spread topographical maps across the table, the kind you could buy at any sporting goods store, marked now with pencil annotations accumulated over 2 weeks of surveillance. Each member of the raid team had been identified, their vehicles documented, their home addresses located, their daily routines observed and recorded. The 3 local deputies who'd participated were known quantities, men who'd grown up in Mercer County, who had families and regular schedules and predictable patterns. The 6 federal agents were newer to the area, but 2 weeks of watching had been enough. People were creatures of habit. They drove the same routes, stopped at the same places, came home at the same times. They felt safe because they were law enforcement, because they believed their badges protected them, because they couldn't imagine that anyone would actually follow through on warnings they'd dismissed as empty threats. Elijah's planning was methodical, almost clinical. He assigned each son specific targets based on their individual skills and the tactical requirements of each elimination. Carter, the oldest, most experienced, got the federal agents who would be hardest to reach, the ones who stayed in motels in Princeton and traveled in pairs. Mason, steady and patient, got the deputies who had families who would need to be taken at distance to minimize risk of witnesses. Boone, the best shot, the most comfortable in the woods at night, got the targets that required long-range work in difficult conditions. Elijah kept for himself the raid leader, Roland Vickers, the man who'd dismissed the warnings, who'd given the order to destroy 88 years of Harlow heritage. The rules were simple and non-negotiable. Every elimination had to look explainable, at least initially. Hunting accidents, car crashes, random crime. Nothing that would immediately trigger a federal response or bring hundreds of agents swarming into the county. They needed time, needed to work through the list before law enforcement understood what was happening. Space the hits over several days, vary the methods, create enough confusion that pattern recognition would be delayed. No witnesses, no evidence left behind, no deviation from the plan. Each man would work alone unless the target absolutely required coordination. They would use the mountains the way they'd been taught, moving on trails that didn't appear on any map, using terrain for cover, disappearing into hollows where even search teams with dogs would never find them. Elijah laid out the timeline. Begin November 3rd, 2 days from now. Give the federal agents time to relax, to think the warning had been bluster, to fall back into routine. Work through the list systematically, 1 or 2 per day. Never rushing, never making mistakes, born of haste or anger. The goal wasn't revenge in the emotional sense. The goal was justice in the mountain sense, the old code that said when you destroy a man's life after fair warning, you forfeit your own. This wasn't personal. It was principle. The federal government had declared war on mountain people by sending agents to destroy their survival. The Harlows were simply responding in kind, fighting back the only way that made sense when the system itself was the enemy. Carter asked the question, None of them wanted to voice. What happens after? When it's done? When all 10 are gone? What then? Elijah's answer was flat, matter of fact, spoken like he was discussing crop rotation or equipment maintenance. We'll turn ourselves in. We're not running, not hiding. We do what needs doing, then we face what comes. The law will call it murder. We'll call it justice. Jury can decide which it is, but either way, we don't run from consequences. We give fair warning, we follow through, we accept what comes after. That's the code. That's what separates us from them. The sons nodded, understanding completely. This wasn't about escape or survival. This was about honor, about defending family legacy, even when defending it meant sacrificing everything else. Their great-grandfather had built that still. Their grandfather had maintained it. Their father had operated it. And now it was gone, destroyed by men who'd been warned, who'd had every chance to walk away. The Harlows would respond, would make those men and their families pay the price, and then would face whatever justice the system imposed. But first, 10 men would die. One for each decade the still had operated, one for each generation it had sustained, one for each warning that had been ignored. November 3rd, 1980, 9:47 p.m., Route 460, near Bluefield, West Virginia. The temperature had dropped to 29 degrees, cold enough that breath fogged in the air, cold enough that ice was forming in the shadows where moisture collected. The fog had returned, rolling up from the valleys and thick banks that reduced visibility to 50 feet at best. ATF Special Agent Raymond Andrew Cross, 39 years old, father of 2 daughters ages 7 and 9, was driving home after a late dinner in Princeton with 2 other members of Vickers' team. They'd been celebrating the successful Stony Creek raid, drinking beer and telling stories about the look on Vickers' face when he'd smashed the first copper coil. Cross had participated enthusiastically, had personally destroyed 3 of the wooden fermentation barrels, had taken photographs that he planned to use in training presentations about illegal distilling operations. His vehicle, a 1978 Ford Bronco, dark green with government plates, moved slowly through the fog on the 2-lane highway that wound through the mountains between Princeton and Bluefield. Cross was tired, slightly buzzed, not worried about anything except getting home to his motel room and sleeping off the beer. He'd dismissed the warning Vickers had received, had laughed about it with the others, hillbilly tough talk that didn't mean anything. These people made threats all the time, all empty, all forgotten within a week. The raid was over, the still was destroyed, case closed. In a few days, they'd hit another operation and another, until every moonshiner in Mercer County understood that federal law meant something even in these backwoods mountains. 300 yards ahead on a ridge line that overlooked Route 460 where it curved through a gap between hills, Boone Harlow lay prone in wet leaves. His Winchester rested on a fallen log, the scope adjusted for distance and elevation. He'd been in position for 40 minutes, had watched 2 other vehicles pass, had waited with the patience of a hunter who'd spent hundreds of hours in deer stands waiting for exactly the right shot. The headlights of Cross's Bronco appeared in the fog like dim yellow spheres, moving at perhaps 30 miles per hour, cautious because of visibility. Boone tracked the vehicle through his scope, breathing slow and steady, waiting for it to reach the exact point he'd chosen. A straight section of road with a steep embankment on the right side that dropped 60 feet to a creek bed. The range was 280 yards, not particularly difficult for a shooter of Boone's skill, but complicated by fog and darkness and the need for immediate incapacitation. He aimed for the driver's side window, led the target by 18 inches to account for vehicle speed and bullet travel time, exhaled halfway, and squeezed the trigger with steady pressure. The rifle cracked once, the sound echoing off the hills and dissipating into fog. Through the scope, Boone saw the driver's window explode, saw the Bronco veer sharply right, saw it leave the road and tumble down the embankment in a chaos of breaking glass and crumpling metal. He waited, watching through the scope for any sign of movement. There was none. The vehicle came to rest on its roof in the creek, headlights still burning, steam rising from the engine. Boone withdrew slowly, carefully, collecting his spent brass, brushing away any sign he'd been there. He moved down the ridge on a game trail that wouldn't show boot prints, circled wide around the crash site, and by 10:15 was 2 miles away, his rifle broken down and stored in a waterproof case, his hands washed clean in a different creek. Behind him, Raymond Cross lay dead in the wreckage, his neck broken by the impact, the bullet wound through his head, ensuring he'd never regained consciousness even if the crash hadn't killed him. It would be classified as an accident initially, a tragic result of driving too fast in heavy fog on dangerous mountain roads. The first target was eliminated. 9 remained. November 4th, 1980 began with the discovery of Raymond Cross's body at 6:20 a.m. when an early morning driver spotted the wreck in the creek bed. State police arrived by 7, documented the scene, noted the bullet hole through the driver's window that immediately changed the investigation from accident to homicide. By 9 a.m., the ATF field office in Princeton was in emergency session. Vickers trying to understand how one of his agents had been murdered less than 72 hours after the Stony Creek raid. The warning he'd dismissed suddenly seemed less empty, less hillbilly bluster. But even then, he couldn't quite believe that someone would systematically hunt federal agents. One murder could be an angry individual, someone with a grudge, not necessarily connected to the raid. He doubled security, ordered his agents to travel in pairs, notified state and local law enforcement to be vigilant. That same day, November 4th, 2:40 p.m., Deputy Marcus Webb, 44 years old, married with 3 children, was driving his personal vehicle, a 1976 Chevrolet pickup, along a logging road in the National Forest, 15 miles north of Princeton. Webb had participated in the raid, reluctantly, had tried to warn Vickers about the Harlows, but had ultimately followed orders because that's what deputies did. Now he was checking on a hunting cabin he owned, a place he went to think, to get away from the stress of a job he'd grown to hate. The logging road was rough, deeply rutted, the kind of track that saw maybe 5 vehicles per month. Webb wasn't expecting trouble, wasn't even armed, had his hunting rifle locked in a case behind the seat. Mason Harlow had followed him from town, staying far enough back to be invisible, knowing exactly where Webb was going because Mason had hunted these same woods for 20 years. He'd positioned himself at a tight curve where the logging road crossed a steep washout, where Webb would have to slow to walking pace to navigate the ruts. Mason waited behind a massive oak, his rifle ready, his breathing calm. When Webb's pickup slowed to 5 miles per hour, struggling through the washout, Mason stepped into the road 20 feet behind the vehicle and fired twice through the rear window. Both shots hit Webb in the back of the head. The truck rolled forward another 30 feet and stopped, engine still running. Mason approached carefully, confirmed the kill, wiped down anything he might have touched, and disappeared into the forest. Webb's body wouldn't be found until November 6th, when his wife reported him missing and search teams located the truck. November 5th brought 2 more deaths. ATF Special Agent Thomas Kirby, 36 years old, was shot at 1:15 p.m. while hunting deer on private land near Montcalm. The official story would be hunting accident, struck by a stray bullet from an unknown hunter who'd fled the scene. The reality was Carter Harlow, firing from 350 yards, a clean shot through the chest that dropped Kirby instantly. No witnesses, no evidence, just another tragic accident in woods where dozens of hunters operated during deer season. That same evening, November 5th, 9:30 p.m., ATF Special Agent Dale Morrison, 51 years old, died when his vehicle experienced sudden brake failure on a steep mountain road and crashed through a guardrail, plunging 200 feet into a ravine. Investigation would eventually reveal that the brake lines had been cut, but determining when and where would prove impossible. By November 6th, the pattern was undeniable. 5 law enforcement officers dead in 4 days, all connected to the Stony Creek raid. Vickers requested emergency support from FBI headquarters, from state police, from every agency that could send resources. But Mercer County covered 420 square miles of mountains, hollows, and forest. The Harlows knew every trail, every cave, every hiding spot. They moved like ghosts, struck without warning, vanished completely. November 6th, 1980, 3:20 a.m., Deputy James Sutton, 48 years old, father of 4, died in a barn fire at his rural property near Athens. The fire was ruled suspicious immediately, gasoline used as accelerant. But Sutton's body showed no signs of struggle, no indication he'd even woken before the smoke took him. Carter Harlow had approached the property at 2 a.m., had waited until he was certain Sutton was asleep, had doused the barn's wooden walls with 5 gallons of gas, lit it, and was 3 miles away before the first flames were visible. Sutton had died of smoke inhalation, probably never regaining consciousness, probably never knowing why. The barn burned completely, taking evidence with it. Investigators found nothing useful. That same day, November 6th, 11:45 a.m., ATF Special Agent Michael Torres, 29 years old, newest member of Vickers' team, unmarried, ambitious, disappeared while jogging on a trail near Pipestem State Park. His body was discovered November 8th by hikers partially hidden in brush 200 yards off the trail. Single gunshot wound to the chest. No shell casings found. No evidence of struggle. Boone Harlow had tracked him like prey, had waited until Torres was in a section of trail that saw minimal traffic, had called out to him, had shot him when Torres turned toward the sound. Clinical, efficient, no different than dropping a deer except the target wore running shoes and a college sweatshirt. November 7th dawned cold and clear, temperature at 26 degrees. Frost, thick on every surface. Deputy Carl Bishop, 52 years old, was shot through his kitchen window at 6:15 a.m. while making coffee. The bullet came from 240 yards away, fired from a wooded ridgeline that overlooked Bishop's property. Mason Harlow had been in position since 5 a.m., had watched the house through his scope, had waited for Bishop to present himself in the window's frame. One shot, clean kill, Bishop dead before he hit the floor. Mason was packed and gone within 3 minutes, moving through woods he'd played in as a child, using trails that weren't marked on any map. Bishop's wife found him 7 minutes later. By then, Mason was a half-mile away and accelerating. By November 7th afternoon, Roland Vickers understood he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. 8 of his 10-man raid team were dead. Only he and Deputy Frank Collins remained alive, and Collins was so terrified he'd barricaded himself in his home and refused to come out. Vickers was in a motel room in Welch, surrounded by state police and FBI agents, trying to coordinate a response while simultaneously preparing for his own death. He'd requested armored vehicles, helicopters, tracking dogs, everything the federal government could provide. But none of it mattered. You couldn't armor every window, couldn't guard every approach, couldn't maintain that level of security indefinitely. The Harlows had time, patience, and home field advantage. The media had descended on Mercer County. National news crews, broadcasting from Princeton, reporters trying to understand how 4 men were systematically eliminating law enforcement officers in broad daylight and vanishing without trace. Psychologists offered profiles. Law enforcement experts discussed tactics. Politicians demanded action. But nobody who understood mountain culture was particularly surprised. The Harlows had given warning. The warning had been ignored. Now consequences were being delivered exactly as promised. This wasn't insanity or random violence. This was mountain justice, old code written in blood, playing out the way it had played out for centuries. When outsiders came into the hills and tried to impose their rules without understanding the costs. Vickers sat in his motel room, understanding finally that he'd never really seen these people as human. He'd seen them as statistics, as criminals to be arrested, as problems to be solved with paperwork and sledgehammers. He hadn't considered that destroying their livelihood meant destroying their lives. Hadn't considered that desperate men with military training and intimate knowledge of terrain would fight back. Hadn't considered that mountain codes might run deeper than fear of federal prosecution. Now 8 men were dead, 8 families destroyed. And he was next on a list being executed with military precision by people he'd dismissed as backwards hillbillies. November 7th, 1980, 6:30 p.m. The Mountaineer Motel in Welch, West Virginia, had become a fortified position. Roland Vickers and Deputy Frank Collins occupied room 214 on the 2nd floor, surrounded by 12 state police officers, 6 FBI agents, and enough firepower to hold off a small army. Roadblocks had been established on every approach to the town. Helicopters, with thermal imaging equipment, circled overhead despite the darkness and fog. Sharpshooters watched from adjacent buildings. Every precaution that law enforcement could conceive had been implemented. Vickers sat on the edge of the bed, his service pistol on the nightstand, a shotgun leaning against the wall, wearing a bulletproof vest even inside the room. Collins paced continuously, chain-smoking Marlboros, flinching at every sound. 8 of their colleagues were dead. Neither man harbored any illusions about surviving the night. The Harlow family had observed the security buildup throughout the afternoon from various positions in the wooded hills surrounding Welch. They'd watched the roadblocks go up, counted the officers, noted the helicopter patterns, and adapted their plan accordingly. Frontal assault was impossible and unnecessary. The motel backed up against national forest land, thick woods that rose steeply up a ridgeline. Security had focused on the roads, the parking lot, the visible approaches. The woods behind the building had motion sensors and 2 officers on patrol, but the sensors could be avoided by anyone who understood how they were positioned, and 2 officers couldn't cover 300 yards of forest perimeter effectively. At 7:15 p.m., Elijah, Carter, Mason, and Boone moved through those woods like shadows, using terrain features they'd scouted that afternoon, approaching from 4 different angles to split any response. They wore dark clothing, moved without lights, communicated with hand signals learned in military service, and perfected through decades of hunting together. The motion sensors never triggered because they approached from angles the sensors didn't cover. Knowledge gained by watching installation crews that afternoon. The 2 patrol officers never saw them because the Harlows moved between patrol circuits, timing their advance to the second. By 7:40 p.m., all 4 were in position along the tree line 150 yards from the motel's rear wall, with clear lines of sight to room 214's windows. The room's curtains were drawn, but thin enough that thermal imaging, something the Harlows didn't have but didn't need, would have shown 2 figures inside. Elijah had already calculated bullet trajectory, accounting for window glass, curtain material, and interior wall construction. Standard motel walls, drywall over studs, offered no meaningful protection against 30-06 rounds fired from 150 yards. The vests Vickers and Collins wore would stop handgun rounds but not rifle bullets traveling at 2,700 feet per second. Elijah gave the signal, 4 fingers, then a closed fist. 4 shots, simultaneous, through the rear wall at chest height, where the thermal signatures would be strongest. At 7:46 p.m., the night exploded with rifle fire. 4 Winchesters fired within a half second of each other, 8 rounds total in rapid succession, all aimed at the motel's rear wall, room 214 specifically. Inside that room, Roland Vickers died instantly, 3 bullets striking him in the torso and head. Frank Collins took 1 round through the chest and collapsed, mortally wounded, but not yet dead. The security perimeter erupted in chaos, officers running toward the sound, helicopters dropping lower, spotlights sweeping the woods. But the Harlows were already moving, separating, disappearing into terrain they knew with absolute intimacy. Boone went north along the ridgeline. Carter went east down a creek bed. Mason went south through dense laurel thickets. Elijah went west, climbing higher, using a game trail that switchbacked up the mountain and emerged 2 miles away near an abandoned mine entrance. By 8:15 p.m., all 4 were clear of the immediate area, moving through darkness toward predetermined rally points. Behind them, law enforcement searched frantically, with dogs and thermal equipment and helicopters, finding nothing but boot prints that led in 4 directions and disappeared into terrain too rough for effective pursuit at night. Frank Collins died in the ambulance at 8:32 p.m., bringing the death toll to 10. The Stony Creek Massacre, as it would be called, was complete. 10 law enforcement officers eliminated in 5 days, killed by 4 men who'd given fair warning and followed through with military precision. The manhunt that followed would be the largest in West Virginia history, but the Harlows had already decided it would end on their terms. They'd accomplished what mountain justice demanded. Now they would face what the law demanded. But first, they needed to disappear long enough to make the point clear. This hadn't been random violence or criminal insanity. This had been calculated response to an offense committed after explicit warning. The federal government had declared war on mountain families. The Harlows had fought back and won. Now they would surrender, but only when they were ready, only after making absolutely certain that everyone understood exactly why 10 men had died. November 8th, 1980. Dawn broke over Mercer County with temperatures at 24 degrees and frost so thick it looked like snow. 237 law enforcement officers had flooded into the area overnight. FBI agents, ATF reinforcements, state police. From across West Virginia, even National Guard units activated by the governor. Roadblocks choked every major route. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment swept the mountains continuously. Tracking dogs worked grid patterns through the forests. The largest manhunt in state history was underway, searching 420 square miles of some of the most difficult terrain in the eastern United States for 4 men who knew every hollow, every cave, every abandoned mine shaft. The Harlows had vanished completely. Elijah had led his sons to a network of locations, prepared over the preceding 2 weeks, places where they could shelter, rest, and move between without exposure. Abandoned coal mines offered miles of tunnels where thermal imaging was useless and dogs lost scent in the stale underground air. Caves known only to local hunters provided shelter invisible from aerial search. Safe houses, families sympathetic to the Harlows, or at least opposed to federal overreach, offered food and information about search patterns. The mountains themselves were allies, terrain so broken and dense that a man could be 50 feet from a search team and remain completely invisible if he knew what he was doing. For 7 days, the Harlows stayed ahead of the search. They moved primarily at night, using moonless periods and heavy weather for cover. They avoided trails, roads, any route that could be easily blocked or monitored. They lived on cached supplies, deer jerky and hardtack, canteens of creek water. They slept in shifts, never all at once, always maintaining watch. Elijah coordinated movement using knowledge accumulated over 57 years in these mountains. Carter and Mason contributed tactical expertise from military service. Boone navigated terrain that would have killed less experienced woodsmen, finding paths through laurel thickets and across rock fields that left no tracks. The media coverage was intense. National news broadcasting hourly updates. Politicians demanding results. Experts analyzing how 4 men could evade such massive resources. Some portrayed the Harlows as dangerous criminals, cop killers who deserved execution. Others, particularly in Appalachian communities, saw them differently, as desperate men pushed beyond endurance by government that didn't understand or care about mountain life. The narrative split along predictable lines: urban versus rural, federal authority versus regional autonomy, law and order versus economic justice. Nobody disputed the facts. The Harlows had killed 10 men. The question was whether those killings were murder or something more complicated, whether mountain justice had any validity in a modern legal framework. Sheriff Tom McKenzie, who delivered the initial warning to Elijah, gave one interview on November 12th before retiring immediately and refusing all further contact with media. He said simply that this tragedy had been entirely preventable, that destroying the Stony Creek still had been both legal and catastrophically stupid, that anyone who understood mountain culture could have predicted exactly what happened. He was criticized for sympathizing with cop killers, defended by locals who knew he was telling truth nobody wanted to hear. The interview ended his career, but established the narrative that would persist for decades. The Harlows were murderers under the law. They were also victims of a system that had failed to protect their livelihood and then punished them for surviving the only way they knew how. By November 14th, the manhunt had become expensive and embarrassing. Despite unlimited resources, despite technology and manpower and political pressure, law enforcement had found nothing. The Harlows had demonstrated that motivated men with local knowledge could evade any pursuit if they were willing to endure hardship, and had prepared adequately. But Elijah had never intended to run forever. The point had been made. 10 men were dead. Federal agents would think twice before raiding Appalachian stills without considering consequences. Now it was time to face the legal system and let a jury decide whether mountain justice had any meaning. November 15th, 1980, 9 a.m., Elijah Harlow walked into the Mercer County Sheriff's Office in Princeton and surrendered. At the same moment, Carter surrendered at the State Police Barracks in Bluefield. Mason turned himself in to FBI agents in Beckley. Boone appeared at the ATF field office in Charleston. All four had coordinated their surrenders to occur simultaneously at different locations, preventing any possibility of standoff or violence. They came unarmed, cooperative, ready to face whatever came next. The manhunt ended not with dramatic arrests, but with quiet surrender. 4 men who'd accomplished their mission and were prepared to accept consequences. The trial of Elijah, Carter, Mason, and Boone Harlow began April 6, 1981, in federal court in Charleston, West Virginia. The prosecution was handled by the United States Attorney's Office with assistance from ATF and FBI. The charges were straightforward: 10 counts of first-degree murder of federal officers and local law enforcement, conspiracy to commit murder, weapons violations, and obstruction of justice. The evidence was overwhelming. Ballistics matched the Harlow rifles to 6 of the killings. Witnesses placed them near other crime scenes. Their own statements after arrest were frank admissions of exactly what they'd done and why. The prosecution sought the death penalty for all 4 defendants. The defense strategy was equally straightforward. They weren't contesting the facts. Yes, the Harlows had killed 10 men. Yes, it was premeditated and planned. But the defense argued context. Economic desperation, the destruction of an 88-year-old family legacy, the warnings that had been given and ignored, the mountain code that said a man had the right to defend his livelihood when the legal system offered no protection. They brought expert witnesses who testified about Appalachian culture, about the economic devastation of coal country, about unemployment rates and the impossibility of survival through legitimate means. They showed photographs of the destroyed still, emphasized that it had been family heritage dating to 1892, argued that its destruction had been an act of cultural violence that triggered a response rooted in traditions older than the federal government itself. The jury deliberated for 6 days. The outcome was never in doubt regarding guilt. The Harlows had killed 10 men, the evidence was irrefutable, and no amount of cultural context could legally justify murder. The question was sentencing. The prosecution wanted death. The defense wanted life with possibility of parole, arguing that these weren't career criminals, but desperate men driven to extremes by circumstances beyond their control. On June 19, 1981, the jury returned verdicts of guilty on all counts for all 4 defendants, but they rejected the death penalty. One juror, a coal miner from Logan County, held out against execution, arguing that the Harlows had been pushed beyond any reasonable limit and that killing them would be revenge, not justice. The sentences were life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Elijah Harlow, 58 years old at sentencing, was sent to Moundsville Penitentiary. He served 16 years before dying of lung cancer in 1997 at age 74. The black lung that had killed his wife finally taking him too. He never expressed remorse for the killings, maintained until his death that he'd followed the only code he knew, that he'd given fair warning and delivered fair consequences. Carter Harlow served 34 years before dying of a heart attack in 2015 at age 66. He'd spent his decades in prison reading military history and writing letters to his nieces, Mason's daughters, letters that were later published and revealed a man who understood exactly what he'd done and why, who accepted his punishment but never accepted that the government had been right to destroy the still. Mason Thomas Harlow is still living, 72 years old, in 2024, incarcerated at Mount Olive Correctional Complex. His daughters visit monthly, bringing grandchildren he's watched grow up through prison visiting room glass. He maintains the same quiet demeanor he had before the killings, speaks rarely about that November, focuses instead on encouraging his grandchildren to get educations and leave the mountains for places with opportunities. Boone William Harlow, the youngest, deadliest, quietest of the brothers, was killed in a prison fight in 1989 at age 34. He'd intervened in an assault on an older inmate, taken a shank to the chest, bled out before medical staff arrived. Even in prison, even facing death, he'd followed the code his father taught: protect those who can't protect themselves, never back down, never show fear. 44 years have passed since that November in the West Virginia mountains. The Stony Creek Massacre remains one of the most controversial cases in Appalachian history, a touchstone for debates about federal authority versus regional culture, about economic justice and desperate violence, about whether any code of honor can justify killing 10 men who were simply doing their jobs. The families of the dead law enforcement officers have lived with emptiness that can never be filled. Raymond Cross's daughters grew up without their father, attended college on survivor benefits, became teachers who've spent their lives helping children in communities like the ones that killed their dad. They don't speak publicly about the case, but their silence carries its own weight. Deputy Marcus Webb's wife never remarried, raised 3 children alone on a sheriff's pension that barely covered rent. 2 of those children left West Virginia and never returned, unable to separate the mountains from the trauma. The third stayed, became a social worker, tries to help families before desperation drives them to violence. Michael Torres's mother buried her youngest son at 29, spent the next 20 years trying to understand how her boy's idealism about law enforcement had led to a bullet in the woods. She died in 2009, still searching for answers that don't exist. The other families carry similar burdens, lives permanently altered by 5 days in November, when mountain justice collided with federal law and left 10 bodies across Mercer County. The Harlow family paid their own price. Ruth Ellen Harlow's grave in the cemetery at Stony Creek Baptist Church is visited regularly by Mason's grandchildren, who bring flowers and stand looking at a stone that marks a woman who died before the killing started, spared the knowledge of what her husband and sons would become. The homestead where Elijah raised his boys, where the War Council met on November 1st, 1980, collapsed during a winter storm in 2008. Today it's just a foundation overgrown with kudzu and poison ivy, the chimney still standing like a gravestone marking where a family lived before everything went wrong. Nobody has built there since. Local people say the land remembers, that violence leaves marks on the earth that time can't erase. The still site at Stony Creek Hollow was reclaimed by forest within 5 years. The hemlocks that provided cover still stand. The spring still runs cold and pure. Hikers occasionally find pieces of copper in the leaf litter, fragments of coils that once represented 5 generations of family heritage. There's no marker, no sign, nothing to indicate that this clearing was the center of a tragedy that killed 14 people, 10 law enforcement officers, and 4 Harlow men whose lives ended in prison. The Forest Service knows the history but doesn't publicize it, preferring to let the woods keep their secrets. Federal policy regarding Appalachian moonshine raids changed after Stony Creek. The ATF developed new protocols emphasizing negotiation over confrontation, economic assistance over prosecution, recognition that destroying a family's only income source might trigger responses that pure law enforcement approaches couldn't handle. Whether this represented genuine understanding or simply fear of retaliation is debatable, but raids became less common, less aggressive, more likely to end with fines and probation than sledgehammers and arrests. The Harlows had made their point in the most terrible way possible. Touch mountain people's survival, and some will die rather than submit. West Virginia changed after that November, but not permanently. For a few years, people were kinder to each other, settled disputes before they could escalate, remembered that everyone was struggling. The desperation could turn anyone into something they'd never imagined becoming. But the change wasn't permanent. Within a decade, new people moved in who didn't know the story. Economic pressures returned. Coal continued its decline. Unemployment remained catastrophic. The lessons faded like morning fog burning off the ridges. Human nature being what it is, the warnings were forgotten. Retired FBI Special Agent Thomas Crawford, who'd participated in the manhunt, gave a podcast interview in 2019 about the case. He said, Legally, the Harlows were mass murderers. Morally, they were desperate men in a failed system. The law is clear, but morality, that's messier. I've lived with that contradiction for 40 years. Still don't have an answer. Were they monsters? Were they victims? Were they both? How do you reconcile 10 dead cops with an 88-year-old still that represented the only thing keeping a family alive? I don't know. Nobody knows. The Harlow story has no heroes. It has a father who valued his family's legacy more than 10 human lives, and it has law enforcement officers who followed orders without understanding the cultural and economic context they were operating in. It has a system that failed at every level, an economy that abandoned Appalachia, leaving people with no legal way to survive, federal policies that treated symptoms without addressing causes, and a code of honor so rigid it made mass murder seem like the only response to having your livelihood destroyed. Were the Harlows murderers? Yes. They eliminated 10 people with premeditation and planning, some while they slept, without trial, without mercy. Were they also products of a broken system, defending the only inheritance they had in the only way their culture recognized? Also, yes, the uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously. And that's the most disturbing part of this story, because it forces us to ask questions we'd rather avoid. What would we do if someone destroyed not our money, but our identity, our legacy, the only inheritance we had to pass to our children? How far would we go to protect what defines us when the legal system offers no protection? Does justice exist when the law recognizes property rights but not cultural heritage? When you can be prosecuted for making whiskey but not compensated when the government destroys equipment that sustained your family for nearly a century? The Harlows crossed a boundary no human being should cross. But that boundary existed in a world where federal law couldn't or wouldn't recognize what mattered to mountain people, where economic collapse had eliminated every legitimate option, where warnings were given and ignored because agents from Richmond couldn't imagine that hillbillies would actually fight back. There's no easy answer, no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion where good triumphs and evil is punished. Just a simple and terrible truth. Violence breeds more violence. Broken systems create desperate people. And sometimes the line between protecting your family and becoming a monster becomes so thin it disappears entirely, leaving only bodies and questions and children who grow up without fathers on both sides of the massacre. If this story made you think about justice, desperation, and the price we pay when systems fail and old codes collide with modern law, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about federal authority and regional culture, about how far ordinary people will go when pushed beyond endurance. Comment below. What would you have done in Elijah Harlow's position? Where do you draw the line between protecting what's yours and losing your humanity in the process? Because these stories aren't just history, they're happening right now somewhere, with different people facing the same impossible choices in forgotten counties where the system has failed and desperation takes hold. The names change, the circumstances evolve, but the fundamental question remains. What are we willing to become to protect what we love? Until next time, remember the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made, one destroyed still, one ignored warning, one desperate family at a time. And the line between justice and vengeance is drawn not in law books, but in the human heart, where it's always been thinnest, always been easiest to cross, always been hardest to find our way back from.